This video is a tutorial for the Civil Air Patrol Flight Simulation Team for the Private Pilot's Qualification level. This is an introductory level flight, the basic VFR integrating VOR navigation skills with some rudimentary charted arrivals. And since this is a simple beginner's flight, there is some pre-work we want to make sure that we have addressed before we move on to this check ride. First of which is to be sure we have the knowledge of the forces of flight, that you have some basic handling skills on the Cessna 172, you have basic knowledge of the flight simulation system controls, and also knowledge of patterns, entering a pattern, some knowledge of sectionals and the related maps, knowledge of VORs, radials, and how to set NAV1 and OBS to track a VOR. Because this is a basic session, there are some things that we will not be covering that we will cover in later, more advanced sessions, including engine startup. We will assume that the engine is running when we start this. We won't be covering weight and balance of aircraft, although that will become critical later on, nor fuel loading. We will not be interacting with air traffic control, and we will not be considering the proper altitudes for westbound versus eastbound flight. With that in mind, there are some objectives that we need to be sure to complete in order to pass this check ride. And the objectives for this check ride are: we must maintain controlled and level flight. We must have control over the aircraft. We need to trim the aircraft for balanced flight. We will have a climb and maintained assigned altitude. We won't be flying all over the sky. We will maintain an assigned altitude. And then we will intercept an outbound VOR radial. We will return to that outbound radial and maintain course to destination. While en route, we will reset our NAV1 and OBS to acquire an inbound VOR radial to the destination. We will maintain our altitude, speed, and course to destination. We will follow a charted approach procedure. In this case, it will be the VOR Alpha arrival at KHFD, which is Hartford. And then finally, we will land safely and exit the runway, taxi to parking, and we will shut down the engine. For this flight, our aircraft will be the Cessna 172 Skyhawk, and we will be departing from Danielson, identifier KLZD. We need to be sure that when we set up our aircraft that we do be sure to spawn at the fuel box and not on the runway. This will be critical for later on, because when we work in a networked environment with other aircraft, we don't want to be spawning on the runway, as somebody might be approaching that runway and they will land on you, and that's generally considered bad. For this flight, we're going to have clear skies. Actually, I think I'm going to make this a little bit more interesting. You can do clear skies if you like, but we're going to do cold fronts just to give us something to look at while we are flying. Once you have that all set up, you can go ahead and load your aircraft, and now let's discuss our flight plan. So for this flight, you can use a sectional if you'd like, but I've gone ahead onto skyvector.com and pulled up a zoomed in view of the airspace that we're going to be working in. And we can see, of course, is the Danielson Airport here. But we can also see the Putnam VOR located here, the frequency 117.4. Our destination is Hartford Airport, but we're going to inbound to the Hartford VOR because we're going to pick up the Hartford VOR Alpha arrival. And this arrival calls for us to pass over the Hartford VOR and then inbound on a 334 heading to get to the runway. So how are we going to do this? First of all, we can draw a plot from the Putnam VOR to the Hartford VOR, and that essentially represents the outbound radial that we are going to fly on. Now, as we know, VORs are oriented to magnetic north, so we can identify our compass points here. That's going to be 360, that's going to be 90, this is going to be 180 down here, and then finally 270 there. So this is roughly, I'm going to call it, 18, 19, 200, 210, 220, 230, 240, 250. I'm going to call that the 250, maybe 255 radial outbound. And that's just a rough approximation. Of course, you can go onto SkyVector and do your flight plan there, and it will tell you exactly. But the point of this exercise is to do some rough estimations. Now, we're going to depart Danielson to the north. So I'm going to go roughly northy that away. I'm going to call it 350, 360 in that direction until I intercept the radial. Now, you could depart to the south here and make a hooky-doo and come back up and intercept it, but either way, we want to get themselves onto the outbound 250 radial out of Putnam, and we're going to do that by first flying north at roughly 350 until we pick that radial up. Then we're going to bang a left-hand turn here, and we're going to fly ourselves down towards Hartford, and en route here, somewhere we're going to transition to inbound onto the Hartford VOR, and that frequency is 114.9. And then as we pass the VOR, we're going to begin our procedure, and note it's a turn to 334, that we need to approach the Hartford VOR at an altitude of 250, and then we're going to start a descent down to 1200, and if we don't see the field, that's going to be a missed approach. But given the weather conditions that we've set for ourselves, I have no worries that we'll be able to see the field inbound. Of course, we'll find out when we get there, so let's go fly it. Okay, we've got our aircraft set up here, and right now I am in F9 3D view. For you future T-prop and jet pilots, you're going to want to get used to using the F10 view, which is the two-dimensional cockpit, only because we're spending a lot of time looking at the instruments when you're in jets and not much time looking out the window. I'm going to use this mode for now while I set up my radios, and as you probably know, we need to first set up the Putnam VOR, and that is 117.4. We do that over here on the Nav1 radio. There we go. Nav1 radio, and we use a little dial here, and you can notice as you hover over it with your hand, the symbol or the mouse changes from a plus sign to a negative sign, and that just means whether you can increase or decrease your numbers. Remember, we enter our frequencies in standby, and then we use the flip switch to bring it up to active. So for now, we just need to switch this over to 117.4. Here we go. We're going to flip and verify that the OBS comes alive. Yes, it does, because it is now picking up the Putnam VOR. So once we've loaded in the proper frequency for the VOR we want to listen to, the next thing we need to do is set up the OBS for the proper radial that we want to intercept. In this case, we want to intercept the 250 radial. So we're going to grab a hold of the OBS knob and give it a spin until up at the top here where the arrow is, we're reading 250. And that's going to identify which radial we want to fly on, and we will know we are on that radial when this needle swings straight and center. Notice we're also getting a DME. We're at roughly 8.5 at this current position to the airport, and we're going to track our DME as we go to make sure that we are actually inbound to the station. Now, there is a discussion we should go into whether we are going to or from the station. We'll do that on our next tutorial. Just know that we are going to the station right now. So basically, we're ready to fly for the most part. Again, this is a very simple setup. We're not going to worry about fuel, passengers, payload, or any of that gobbledygook, but we are going to set up our F9 view here so I can see nicely out the window and that we can see the instruments fairly well. So F11 view will take us outside the aircraft, and the only reason we want to do this is just to make taxiing a bit easier. So here we go. Let's take this aircraft out. Just going to come around from the fuel box here, get behind the aircraft and see what's going on. And this will be a midfield takeoff. Now, some of you new guys might want to go to the end of the runway because nothing is more useless than runway that is behind you. But I'm pretty confident that we can do a midfield departure here. One thing I want to point out as we're pulling up here is the ILS hold short line. And you'll notice as we pull up here, there we go, that there are some painted lines on the field, and those lines right there are the ILS hold short. We cannot cross those lines without clearing that the field is clear of other traffic or that we have clearance to do so from the tower. Now, this is an untowered airport, so we're just going to look both ways really quick, make sure there's nobody coming in, and then we're going to go ahead and head out onto the field. Now, it's a good time to set my flaps for departure. One click on F7 should give us enough flaps to fly, and let's get positioned. And as we're lining up here, we're going to change our view mode Make sure that we are pointed the correct direction. I do want to confirm on my compass that we are vaguely pointed north. That's what we want. And here we go. About 70% throttle to straighten the aircraft out, and then full throttle as we go. Now you'll notice pretty much right away that we are getting a pull to the left from the torque of the propeller at full power. And we're going to deal with that in just a moment, because as we get airborne, you'll also see if I let go of the controls, the aircraft wants to pull to the left because of the torque. Now this is where we need to get into a discussion on trim.
The trim tab is located on the end of the elevator and can be used to set the desired flight attitude or airspeed so that you don't have to keep pushing forward or pulling back on the yoke to hold the attitude or airspeed desired. Moving the trim wheel down causes the trim tab to move down and the nose to move up. Moving the trim wheel up causes the trim tab to move up and the nose to move down. If you find yourself having to push forward on the yoke to maintain an attitude or airspeed, move the trim wheel up until the pressure is relieved on the yoke. If you find yourself having to pull on the yoke to maintain an attitude or airspeed, move the trim wheel down until the pressure is relieved on the yoke. It's almost like the trim wheel is like cruise control. You set the attitude or airspeed by using the trim wheel.
So on the flight simulator program, we do aircraft trimming with the left and right bottom mouse buttons on the joystick. The right click is up trim, the left click is down trim. We are also going to offset the torque of the propeller, and that is done by using Control 0 or Control Enter. Control 0 adds some left rudder, Control Enter adds some right rudder. So as we do this and as we depart, you're going to find your aircraft wants to pull either to the left or down a little bit, so we're just going to go ahead and adjust the trim as we go here. So it's pulling down. I'm adding some back pressure on the stick, but I'm going to add a couple of up trim clicks here to try and get the aircraft to stop fighting me. I want to be able to let go of the stick and have the aircraft maintain level flight. So more or less you can kind of feel that the stick becomes more user-friendly, I guess is the way to describe it. I'm still working on this a bit here, but yeah, a bunch of up trim. Now I can let go of the stick and the aircraft more or less stays in the climb I want. But you'll notice it's pulling to the left, so what I'm going to need here is some right rudder and a bunch of it. There we go. Now it starts to level itself out and go where I want. Now this is a delayed reaction here. You type in a little bit of trim and it takes a second or two for the aircraft to respond to that. So don't try to over trim or go too fast with this. Just a couple of taps until eventually you can let go of everything and the aircraft will maintain level flight. This is what we call a balanced aircraft, and this is what you want, so you're not constantly fighting with the stick to get the aircraft to go where you want. Because if you're fighting with it all the time, then you're not thinking ahead of your aircraft and you're not planning your flight. So alright, so far so good. We're outbound, but we are pulling to the west here. There we go. We're heading a little bit west, I don't want that. I need a little more rudder correction here as well. So we're going to have to come over to the heading that we want, which is going to be, I think we said roughly 350. So I'm going to make a nice gentle turn to the right. By the way, I'm still at full power, so we're going to back down to about 70%. We don't want to run the engine hot the whole time. Coming around. And I'm pretty happy with that for the moment. And there we go. So more or less on course. Again, we're getting some trim issues here, and as you change direction and as you change the torque of the propeller and the engine power, you're going to have to adjust your trim a little bit more as we go. So trim is a constant tap, 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 up, down, whatever it may be. So right now we're cruising at, call it 500 feet per minute vertical climb. Again, I've got some trim issues I got to deal with. We're probably getting thrown around by the wind a bit. And a little more power here because I want to get up to 3,000 feet. DME is at 9, so we're slightly angled away from the station. That's all right. We're just going to tighten up a bit. I am getting a bit of wind, and that might be our cold front that I set up for weather. But again, tap, 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 until the aircraft is going where you want it to go. And of course, there's always the emergency flight controls, hand on stick. Okay, and as we notice here, we're finally starting to get a wiggle on the OBS. the needle is coming around, and when it does that, we're going to need to enter a turn to the left to fly the 250 radial outbound. So we notice the OBS is finally coming around here, and as that starts to happen, we're going to want to enter a turn to the left to fly the 250 outbound. Still battling with some wind and other conditions here, but we're doing all right. So we are now more or less on the 250 radial. So once we cross that radial, we now begin our turn to the left. Ooh, a little bit of gusts, to actually fly that radial outbound to our destination. So we are now joining the highway. We overshot it just a bit, but we're coming around. And I'm now at 270, 260, 250. I'm going to overshoot this turn to 240 to make up just a bit of the overshot we had when we joined the radial. So now, right around in here, we should see the radial OBS needle start to work its way back, and it's sort of kind of doing that. So there we go, more or less on course. And as the needle gets centered, we're going to correct our turn to actually fly 250. So that looks pretty good. Here we go, we're going to finish off that turn, coming around, 250, happy camper. We are now inbound to Hartford, en route to flying the 250. Now the goal here is to make those two pictures look the same, which we've more or less done, so good news there. Okay, so one thing you can kind of do to assist yourself as you're working on this is we can use the autopilot. And down here at the bottom of the radio stack, you're going to see a button that says AP to engage autopilot. Click on the nav button, and that will lock the aircraft onto the radial you want to fly. The aircraft will fly itself on that radial. You can also engage the altitude, and you can type in your altitude here with the up down. You see I've got 3,000 dialed in here. Now you can't use the autopilot for the check ride. That's an automatic fail. However, as you are learning and practicing this lesson, just so you don't have to fight the aircraft all the time, and you want to concentrate on navigating and understanding your position, it is okay to use the autopilot while you are teaching yourself. But again, remember, it's an automatic fail to use the autopilot on the check ride. One thing we also want to verify is that the DME is increasing as we are headed outbound, and you can see it is. That means we are going away from Putnam. That's what we want to be doing. Now the next part of this mission here is to reset our nav radio to pick up the inbound VOR to Hartford. And so if you consult your chart here, you're going to see that the inbound frequency for Hartford is 114.9. So let's go ahead and type that in standby, 114.789. And so theoretically, if we are in range, we should be able to flip, and the OBS will react and we'll be inbound to Hartford. Let's go ahead and flip. Sure enough. Now we're not exactly on the radial we want, so I'm just going to touch it up just a tad. And I'm still in autopilot mode here, so the aircraft is just going to touch up as soon as I re-engage nav, because as soon as you disengage nav, of course, or as soon as you change your frequency, the aircraft doesn't know what VOR you want to listen to. So we got to re-engage nav, and once we do that, the aircraft will start tracking that radial, and you can see here it's engaging a little bit of a turn to do some cleanup work. And that's all good. We got our speed up as well. That's pretty good. 100 knots is pretty good cruising speed for where we're at right now. We want to now verify that the DME is decreasing as we go to Hartford. Sure enough, it is. We have 23 miles to fly. At 100 knots, we should be there pretty quick. So let's start thinking about our next move, because we always want to stay ahead of the aircraft. Our next move is going to be to cross the Hartford VOR. Now you can see for this chart, they want you to come down out of Putnam on the 265 radial to intersection Rambo, which is apparently a spot on the way, and we can triangulate that off of the Norwich VOR. We're not going to sweat that detail right now. But we are coming off of Putnam. We're not coming down this pipe. We are, however, steaming down another pipe here that's more or less going to intercept us with the Hartford VOR. So when it does, and when we overfly that, we're going to shoot a left-hand turn here to 334. We're going to fly that for Looks like a certain number of DME down here. We have to descend. We have to cross at 2500, descend to 1200, and hopefully make this wicked right turn here to hit the field. And if we fail that, we've got an abort here, a missed approach that they want us to head back out to Rambo. I don't think we're going to miss. We're not going to worry about Rambo, but we are steaming down that pipe to get to the Hartford VOR, and that will be our next move. Looks like just passing Wyndham Airport to the left. Steaming down the pipe on a beautiful day in Connecticut. Good day for football. So we're coming up on 9.5 DME to the field. It's now time to start thinking about our next moves. And our next move is going to be to descend. So it's time to bring the aircraft down to the crossing altitude for the Hartford VOR. Now, as you recall, I have the autopilot in right now to help me so I can make this video, but we're going to disengage. And that's the sound we get when we disengage. And now it is the emergency flight controls. And I'm going to go ahead and cut power because, again, we control altitude with the power, not the stick. So we are going to drop on down to about a descent rate of about 500 feet per minute. We can certainly put in a little bit of stick to help us and maintain course and drop on down to 2500. Now, as we get closer to the VOR, you're going to notice that the OBS needle gets a whole lot more sensitive. And that's, of course, because simple geometry. It's really a triangle shape there that the radial highway in the sky is. So as you get closer to the point of that triangle, of course, there's less room for error and the whole thing becomes a bit more sensitive. So our goal is, as much as possible, to keep that needle centered and so that we cross precisely over the Hartford VOR. And that may take a little bit of finagling of the controls to get yourself set up. So we're leveling off now at 2500. We're going to put some power back in and a little bit of lift on the stick and try and get recentered back on that OBS needle to cross the Hartford VOR precisely. Oh, and there we go, picking up a little rain. Good times. Tapping a little bit of trim here. The winds have shifted, our direction has shifted, torque has shifted constantly with the trim. A little bit to the left of the 250, so we're going to come right just a hair here. Again, controlling the aircraft with the trim, not with the stick. Alright, so we're more or less on track here. We've got 1.8 DME to fly, and as we get that close to the station, it's going to be next to impossible to keep your needle centered. And you're going to see it start to drift. That's more or less okay. This is about as close as we're going to get to being on the radial as we cross. But we are 1.4 DME out. I'm pretty comfortable that we're more or less going to cross the station pretty close. So that's good for now. Now we're going to enter the cone of silence relatively soon here, probably in about half a DME. And our next move is going to be to complete that turn to 334 inbound and begin our descent. I'm good. We're going to go ahead and start that turn to 334. So come right. Remember to add a little bit of back stick, because as you turn, you start to lose lift because of the angle of the wings relative to the force of lift. Coming around, coming around, coming around. 330, more or less 334. Let's fix that up just a bit and go ahead and start our descent. Well, yeah. Let's start our descent. And look at that. We just crossed over the cone of silence and the OBS swung on us. So I'm happy. More rain. Good times. I can also start to see Pappy out here. We've got two white lights, which means that we are above the glide slope that we want to be on. So I'm going to go ahead and increase my rate of descent. We're going to cut power some more. I want to see one white and one red on Pappy at this point. There we go. I got one red on top, one white below. That's pretty good. We're on the glide slope. Just a touch of power. Having to keep a fair amount of left stick pressure in here. We're getting some wind. Pappy has changed to white again, so I'm above the glide. We're going to just keep on coming down. We'll pick that glide up again. Pappy should change in a minute. And pretty soon we'll be putting in flaps. There it goes. Pappy is red and white again. So yeah, you sometimes have to make adjustments on your glide slope, but we seem to be doing pretty good. I'm keeping the speed hot right now just so I don't waste time on this arrival by flying around at some slow pokey speed. But as we get in closer, we're going to slow up with the flaps. Glide looks good. One red, one white. Still in the rain. Loving it. Alright, I think it's about time to go ahead and slow up. So F7 twice, put in 2 notches of flaps. We're going to see the nose coming up, so I'm going to need some more downstick pressure to maintain my glide. Speed is down to 80 knots. Glide slope looks good. I'm going to put in 2 more notches of flaps so we now have full flaps. Again, the nose is coming up as lift increases from those flaps. Speed is dropping. Glide slope looks good. I have one hand on the stick and one hand on the throttle, which is where it should be. Now I'm low. I've got 2 red, so let's start to bring the nose up a bit. 2 red on Pappy. 2 red, you're dead. So it's a little bit of power. Bring the nose up just a bit. We're going to fly at this level for a bit and fly to the glide slope. Glide slope is above us right now because we have 2 red. We'll let it come to us. There it is. White and red looking good. Red again. So let's keep a level flight here just a bit. Just keep flying into position. Here we are, white and red. That looks nice. Here comes the runway. Go ahead and start a nice, easy breezy turn. Looks like the runway is wet, so we're going to want to be aware that our braking power may be diminished. Wasn't the best turn, but we're still looking good. We're going to aim for those white stripes. And we're cutting power back. And flare. Whoop, a little bit of float, that's no good. One more time. There we go. And brake and steer. I'm going to go to outside view here so I can exit the runway and see what I'm doing. Brakes are on. Yeah, the diminished braking because of the red one way, but we're okay. I'm going to clean up the flaps now. Go ahead and exit the runway quickly because there may be traffic behind us. And we are clear. If I was on air traffic, I would say Tower 86 Mike, clear of the active runway. And now we can go ahead and taxi. So we're not done until we put the airplane away. Remember, we are simulating real life. Ooh, a little bit of a slide there. Simulating real life, and in real life, we taxi. In fact, we want to practice taxiing and doing it right and properly because most accidents in aircraft occur on the ground while taxiing. Okay, brakes on, control period for brakes. I'm going to go to the main view here. How do we turn off an airplane? We start with a fuel. We pull the mixture out, there it goes, shut down. We turn the master off, we turn everything off, aircraft is done. We can now exit the airplane. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our tutorial for today. Thank you for flying, and go Civil Air Patrol.